Hello and welcome to the Memory Card. Recently, the Spyro Reignited trailer was announced for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Essentially, the Spyro Trilogy from the PlayStation 1 is going to be getting the same treatment that the Crash Bandicoot games on the PlayStation 1 did with the Crash Bandicoot Sane Trilogy. And I get the feeling those games are going to be coming to the Switch as well, considering that the Insane Trilogy is coming to the Switch. That and it would just not make sense to not do that. But anyway, I actually grew up a bit more of a Spyro kid back in the day than Crash Bandicoot, even though I love those games too. So I'm definitely looking forward to the Reignited Trilogy. And to celebrate the imminent release of the Reignited Trilogy, I'm going to take a look at Spyro the Dragon for the PlayStation 1. Spyro the Dragon was released back in 1998, which is often considered one of the best years in video game history, and it's easy to see why when you look back at all the classics that came out that year. But by that point, the PlayStation already had a defining mascot with Crash Bandicoot, and to this day, people seem to think more about Crash ever than they would about Spyro when it comes to the PlayStation 1. But nowadays, Spyro is more defined by Skylanders and the general Toys to Life thing, and that game replaced Spyro pretty quickly with their own original characters, but that doesn't bother me much because, as far as I'm concerned, the Spyro series ended with the original PlayStation, even though they kept making games on the PS2. And it also does note that his design in Skylanders was hideous anyway, so nothing really lost there. Spyro the Dragon was a fairly typical early 90s, well, late 90s, 3D mascot platformer in a lot of ways, but one of the main things that makes it stand out is the gliding mechanic. Spyro is a young dragon, so he's not really able to fly on his own, but the gliding is still very satisfying, and you also basically kill every enemy in this game by either torching them with your flame breath or ramming into them with Spyro's horns, and a lot of those enemies die in 1 or 2 hits. And that sounds simplistic and easy, and for the most part it is, but the game throws the occasional curveball in, and it doesn't really detract from my fun of the game anyway. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Kirby games, and those are all really easy. Considering that this is a 90s 3D mascot platformer, it's also a bit of a collectathon, and your main goal is to find all the dragons that were turned into statues in all the different levels by the villain, Nasty Gnorc, or Gnasty Gnorc in this game. The pronunciation changes depending on which game you're playing. And apparently he has the weakest magic ever because you cure the dragons of their whole turn into a statue thing by just walking up to them. The rest of the collecting in this game is basically covered by finding gems and chasing down those awful little thieves to get dragon eggs from them. And finding those dragon eggs is a motif that continues throughout the Spyro games on the PlayStation. And anyone that played Spyro the Dragon back in the day probably remembers those little awful thieves and how annoying they were to try and catch. That usually was one of the hardest parts of the game. Also, like a lot of other 90s 3D platformers, the levels are all very varied and very colorful and likable. It's generally not very hard to get around to the levels. It's not overly complex level design, but they're all still really fun levels, and I enjoy going through them now in 2018 just like I did back in the late 90s. It's one of those games that aged very well for me, but then again, for people that didn't really grow up with the Spyro games, they might not look back so favorably on these games, but hopefully the Reignited Trilogy will be able to make these games a bit more palatable to modern gamers, or be good for people that grew up with these games like I did to see them how they remember them looking rather than how they actually looked. But even then, I do think that the Spyro games, especially the original one, still looks really good for an old PlayStation 1 3D game. But anyway, Spyro the Dragon isn't extremely hard or anything, but it's still a lot of fun to me. I mainly prefer the Spyro games over the Crash Bandicoot games because I like their more open level design. I like being able to glide around and all the little power-ups you can find in levels, especially as the series progressed. And also, the Spyro games are generally more forgiving than the Crash Bandicoot games were. You would die a lot in a lot of really just cruel levels in the Crash Bandicoot games. And one thing that does actually surprise me is that the ability for Spyro in the original game Spyro the Dragon to roll around to either side by pressing R1 or L1 wasn't kept in the sequels. Also, even though this game is a classic for the PlayStation 1, I actually played the sequels more than this game, but I'll get to those games at another time. The Spyro games largely defined my earliest memories of the PlayStation 1, and the PS1 was actually one of the earliest consoles I played in my young childhood. And considering how young I was whenever I played the PlayStation 1 back then, a lot of the games that defined that console for me were the Spyro games, the Crash Bandicoot games, Medieval, the demo for that, and the demo for Tomb Raider 1 that I had in this demo disc back in the day, and also Twisted Metal 2 thanks to my older brothers. But no matter how many years go by, I still love going back to the original Spyro games. No matter how many games I discover later on about the PlayStation 1's library, like the Final Fantasy games and Castlevania Symphony of the Night and so on and so forth, but I always get a big rush of nostalgia and just happiness whenever I play the old Spyro games or even the Crash Bandicoot games. They definitely define a lot of my early childhood alongside the Pokemon games and things like that. But anyway, I'm really looking forward to covering Spyro 2 and 3 on the PlayStation 1 before the release of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. But regardless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the memory card.